Welcome to the MUFG Global Markets Podcast. I'm John Cook, and I'm joined today by George Goncalves, MUFG's Head of U.S. Macro Strategy. It's Tuesday, April 18th, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast, George.
Hey, John, good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you. And it has been a while since our last podcast, so there's obviously plenty to talk about. Why don't we start by getting caught up? Since we last spoke, I'd argue that we went from fearing the onset of a banking crisis and perhaps something much, much worse to that fear receding pretty significantly, as evidenced by, as example, implied volatility in both equities and rates declining pretty sharply. Although things have seemed to stabilize, by those measures and other measures, I'd argue there's still an air of concern in the markets. So I guess the question for you is the coast clear?
Yeah, let's take a step back because it's been a while since I've been on, and I think it's important to put into context, how we got to where we are right now, and what are both markets and the economy telling us. Looking at maybe look at the economy first, and then we'll get to the markets. There's been a number of data releases since we last spoke. It does look like inflation is heading slightly lower, maybe not as fast as we would like to see, but definitely on the right trajectory. Jobs data continues to kind of give mixed signals because some of the high frequency data on the jobs front does look like it's starting to pick up some of those layoffs that have been announced, and probably has further room to go in terms of more job losses being embedded into the labor data. And yet, it really hasn't been a growth versus inflation story yet. We had the first part of the quarter, January, looked like a start of a really big recovery phase, and then it kind of petered out. And I think now we're just at a point where it's inconclusive, like where we really are in the cycle, but yet the trends are still decelerating. So when that's happening, to me, it still takes a lot to kind of lift us and put us back onto a permanent growth phase that would be consistent with the soft landing narrative. I'm not there yet. I don't think the ingredients are there, that there's still enough deceleration. The consumer has benefited over the last couple of years from a lot of different fiscal stimulus and easy money measures, and now all of those things have gone away. And even though we had a retail sales number that looked like better than expected, in general, there's still a deceleration going on at the consumer level. So I think we have gone to an economy that looked like it was trying to reaccelerate, and now is going sideways to slightly lower again. But that lower trend is consistent with what we had really for the last 9 months to a year, starting last year. So I don't think we've seen yet the low in activity. And then if you look at the markets, we had that bank turmoil towards the end of the quarter, which in my view is, it would be too precise if it would just were to go away without a second or third wave or another look under the hood for where there is still issues within the banking system. The Fed obviously did a tremendous job by providing liquidity where it needed it. The operations of the FDIC, all of these things were done by the textbook and in many ways outside the textbook. But it did create confidence back into the broader markets and the financial system. But yet those losses are still sitting in the system somewhere, which are going to have to be addressed with capital raises, not just liquidity injections. So, with the Fed still keeping rates elevated, maybe hiking a few more times, we'll see, we don't know, and QT still in place, I think it's too soon to say the coast is clear.
Okay, so it's too soon to say the coast is clear. That makes a lot of sense to me. And you mentioned sort of knock-on effects. There's been a lot of discussion on how banks probably pull back lending, at least to some extent. In relation to the sort of mini banking crisis. That resonates a lot with me. You also you talked a little bit about some data there. I know. Speaking of the upcoming mid to late April, heading into things, you were placing a lot of emphasis on CPI, which we got last week, and the upcoming FOMC meeting as a key determinant of your view. That makes a ton of sense. But interestingly enough, last week, it really ended up that retail sales and University of Michigan consumer inflation expectations dictated price action and caused a bit of a sell-off there. As you refine, I'll call it the house view, what are you looking for over the next 2 weeks or so?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to think about that. This, a market that went through an experience in March that got people on edge, and then there's been some signs of stability, and vols have come off, as you mentioned. That now the risk is that we're falling into the complacency mode, where at a minimum there's a no conviction in the marketplace, where as long as there's no new negative bad data or some catalyst that you can't foresee, then that's viewed as a positive. And so when even retail sales was negative, and the fact that it beat expectations, but it was still contracting, it still elicited a kind of a positive reaction. So I still think we're taking it one data point at a time. No one really has a strong edge here, and convictions are relatively low in the markets. And so if we really have been if decision making has been relegated to one report at a time, then there aren't that many reports left between now and the Fed meeting in terms of economic data. We have some PMIs that are coming up, so that's going to be important to see. We had a surprise uplift in the Empire survey from the New York side. We'll see if that carries into the other regions, and broadly if the PMIs for the nation are still showing contraction type levels. And then you have the PCE on April 28th, right before the Fed meeting. And I think also somewhere around this time, towards the early part of May, we'll get an update from the Fed about credit standards, and if banks are tightening their credit standards even further, and that all kind of runs into the Fed meeting. So I'm looking for, and then of course we're in the middle of earnings season with a lot of the smaller bank earnings still ahead of us, and I think that maybe not enough of a catalyst to move the markets completely into a new direction, but it might serve as a reminder of that there is still weaknesses out there outside of the large mega banks. And I think that might be at least a reminder to markets that this is not going to just be fixed with one full swoop. So I think, the combination of remaining earnings for the smaller companies and smaller banks, are they going to be on par with the larger institutions? And if not, does that kind of show there's fragilities both in the financial system and the economy? The PCE data before the Fed, the SLOOS data, which we call the Senior Loan Officer Survey, information on bank lending and standards, and then the Fed meeting itself, and of course the ECB. Like once we get through all that, which is a lot, which I just went through, I think then the playing field is pretty level for us to make a directional view on where we go for both risk and as well as rates. Typically, if this truly ends up being the last hike for the cycle, usually rates catch a bid, even mortgages start to perform better. And if it's happening at a time where the economy is still decelerating, that would be at the expense of credit and equities. But we'll see. I mean, we have the debt ceiling, which we should probably save for another podcast later down the road. But I think that once we move beyond these near-term catalysts, I think it's going to be back to liquidity concerns.
Yeah, that is a lot. And you obviously didn't mention, but I know is totally on your radar. You got the BOJ meeting on April 28th, which is Ueda's first meeting. I think also, most recent signs point to him not doing anything, but again, very possible that the BOJ rips off the Band-Aid on yield curve control, which could obviously be a huge determinant for price action in global markets, right?
100%.
Yeah. So, great stuff as always, George. And just before I forget, I would encourage our listeners to review the upcoming MUFG Global Markets Monthly, which George is one of our many distinguished contributors to. And if you are not receiving George's strategy reports, please do get in contact with him directly. Great stuff as always, George. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, John.
And thank you for listening to the MUFG Global Markets Podcast. Rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And reach out to your MUFG sales rep for any further information. Check back soon for more insights from the Global Markets Research Team.